This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 66. My name is Dominic. I'm one of the co-hosts of this show. The other co-host is named Janus, who will be joining us shortly. Today we speak to author Gregory Peters. From the original New Falcon website, Gregory Peters is a researcher and explorer of non-dual tantra, consciousness, and the convergence of Eastern and Western spiritual practices. He is initiated in Hindu, Buddhist, and Western tantric lines, and is a senior adept in various occult traditions. Through his written works, he delves into the mystical and energetic dimensions of human experience, drawing from his experience with Tantra, Dream Yoga, and esotericism to explore the awe and wonder of embodied experience. And what we will be talking with Gregory about is the Yogini and his book on the Yogini, which is titled Yogini Magic. You can find that on newfalcon.com, as well as other places that you buy books. You can find more about Gregory at his website, gregorypetersauthor.com. Before we jump into the episode, we would like to thank our Patreon supporters. Because of your support, we can do what we do. If you'd like to support this work and ensure that we continue creating content month after month, year after year, feel free to head over to Patreon, look us up, and do what feels right for you. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may any merit accumulated doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening. Okay, welcome to the show. We are really excited to speak with Mr. Gregory Peters today. He's the author of Yogini Magic, as well as the out-of-print Magical Union of East and West through Llewellyn. We are going to discuss Yogini, Dakini. I'm sure we'll touch on Kali and all sorts of other things. Welcome to the show, Gregory.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you on. This is going to be an intriguing conversation.
Yeah, long time in the works.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, that's just a sign that, it was there's a lot of energy behind it.
Exactly.
Totally.
We got the momentum going. So let's keep that momentum and maybe start off, as we usually do, just kind of discussing a little bit about your background, specifically how you got into this topic, and we'll just run from there.
Yeah, the Yoginis specifically are an interesting presence for me. I mean, I would say the first indications that I was working with them was when I was in Nepal. I was trekking through Nepal, and that location in general is just such a magical and spiritual place. So it really kind of puts your consciousness, your awareness into a whole different kind of setting, I guess. I mean, at least for me, it was a total reset in a lot of ways. And yeah, so I was solo trekking through Nepal. I had a local guide who was helping me out. But during those long hours, just solitary in the mountains with, a lot of time, nothing but the crunch of your feet underneath and the sound of the wind through the mountains or through the different trees, things just started to come together in an energetic sense. And that was where Kali, in particular, I had my first direct experience of her. I talk about this a bit in the book, but it came across in such a way that after the initial kind of hit, it felt like sorry, I'm stumbling over myself because there's just a lot of emotions involved with it, but it was like this this vision and this sensory experience and kind of everything just hit all at once. And it was stunning. It's kind of the word I always come back to. It stunned my mind. And there was just this complete cool silence. And then a mantra starts resounding in my head. And I don't know, time-wise, I mean, it wasn't very long, right? Like, I'm sure maybe just a minute or two. And then my rational mind starts kicking back in and going through all these different conditions, like, oh, maybe it's altitude sickness, or all these kind of different sort of explanations for it. But that experience stuck with me, and it came home with me. I mean, she came home with me in a very direct way.
Are you open to talking a little bit about what you saw or encountered during that experience? Because you're speaking about the goddess Kali, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was how I interpreted her. It was Kali. It was the goddess, and her presence is all over Nepal, of course, but it was a full sensory experience. So, I mean, there was the scent of some perfume, some wildflower scent. And then the vision of, this goddess with all of this hair, her face right in front of me, her three eyes looking right into my heart, and the mantra Krim, which was just resounding in everything, really. And just this pulsation, this incredible radiance everywhere. I mean, you look at iconography of her and she appears very dark and scary and foreboding, but this experience, she was radiance. I mean, it was like her hand reached into my skull, cracked it open, and just nectar pouring in. The most incredible bliss and radiance and just contentment, really, that flowed through. And it's something that, I mean, even today I continue to kind of process, because you get a little more of it every time. I kind of liken it to when you have a really intense dream, and while you're in the dream, there are so many details and so many experiences that you have. Time seems to stand still, or maybe it goes really fast or slow. But then you wake up and there's just that essence of the dream, of the details. But then the more you go back and analyze it and meditate on it, details start to come back and elaborate. And it's almost like that initial impulse, it's an initiation. It plants a seed, and that seed continues to grow inside of you, and things come out of it is really how I think of it. And one of those things, I guess, was the 64 yoginis. When I first started working with them, I called them dakinis. Dakini, of course, appears in Tibetan Buddhism, which had been most of my experience before I got to Nepal, through working with Namkhai and Norbu and Dzogchen practices. But really, I wasn't getting into the really esoteric stuff. So it was essentially more meditation, contemplation, I would say, that type of thing, just coming into this awareness of intrinsic awareness, this sort of non-dual awareness. What was I saying? Yeah, dakinis. So dakini was the term I was familiar with. But then I also learned fairly early on that dakinis are also spoken about in the Hindu tantras and in Hinduism. Dakini just means witch, essentially.
Yeah.
Right. So dakinis, yoginis, I quickly found out that the two terms are referring to the same types of beings, although depending on what context they appear in, they may have very different forms and roles, I guess you could say. And I think the more well-known roles tend to come from the tantric Buddhist side, the Vajrayana side, with the dakinis. So you have, these treasure revealers and protectors, right? The Dakinis guard the teachings. They may reveal teachings. They're pretty closely associated with this idea of energy. And you can see where that comes from on the Hindu tantric side, because again, yoginis have this association with Shakti, which is power, the ultimate power, feminine power specifically, but it's embodied by everyone, by everything, really, depending on how you're looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, the yoginis, have these different powers associated with them. They may be guardians as well, but they have a very different appearance than you'll find in Nepal, for example. So these kind of things all started to come together in my own personal practice. I mean, I didn't have any type of formal instruction when it came to the yoginis. It was more a case of where I'd be working with Kali and just get these impressions of additional energies that were around the circle where I'm working. And I just started researching into Kali herself and her different sadhanas and practices. And it was like the light bulbs started to switch on. As I realized, oh, these energies have names and they have forms. And that explains why I'm seeing this over here or feeling this when, this other thing happens.
So, Greg, may I ask you something?
Yeah.
Would you say that, so I love how you're describing this because it's clear that this is insight that originated in experience. You're talking about experientially derived insight, which is something that we're very much focused on with our work with this podcast. But my question for you is, would you then say that the yogini it almost seems as if you're describing them as emanations of Kali?
So that's one of the interesting aspects of them. They are very protean, they're hard to nail down. And I try to go over this in the book, some of the different ways they've been presented through the literature and just through traditions and people's experience. But I mean, you're exactly correct in the sense that according to some traditions, they are emanations of the goddess. And that goddess might be represented as Kali. Another common representation is as Tripura Sundari. She has yoginis as well. So any of the goddesses that you might take a closer look at, their sadhanas their tantric sadhanas will often have these yoginis associated with them.
And for those who are listening, who are coming from a more Western approach, sadhana just means practice, esoteric or ceremonial or ritual or yogic practice. Is that correct, Greg?
That's correct. Yeah. I tend to classify a sadhana as usually a tantric practice as opposed to puja, which is the outer worship, sort of the ritual practices. So sadhana and puja, two different ways of approach in these contexts. So it's really going to depend on one's point of view. So if you're coming in through, say, one of these very traditional tantric lineages, say a Kala lineage, you would be taught a specific set of yogini names that are associated with the yantra, the magical diagram that describes a particular deity and her palace, her universe, right? So these are kind of the encoded forms of the yoginis that came into the tantric lineages. But predating a lot of these formal lineages, the yoginis were countless. There's been research that has found different name lists with not a lot of surrounding ritual around them. Sometimes it's just, engraved names, 64 names with no description whatsoever. These are called Namavali, name lists. And so the different villages in India, each one may have a different set of yoginis. And it's kind of like angel lists in a way, where you can have like maybe different Michaels, maybe Michael an archangel, Michael a lower angel, all these entities named Michael, but they're different energies. So in the same way, on these Namavalis, you can find yoginis that may have the same name, but they're completely different, just energetically. So I guess my point was that, yeah, from the perspective of emanations of the goddess. So if you look at something like the Devi Mahatmya, which is an older text that describes the goddess Durga and the emanation of Kali from Durga's forehead and these great battles against different demons and whatnot. The yoginis come out as emanations of the goddess, be it Kali or Durga or Tripura Sundari and so on. And that tends to be how I look at them, as emanations of the goddess, but that's also because I tend to see everything as emanations of the goddess, as Shakti.
Right.
But the beauty of it is that there is no one answer. If you're going to work with the yoginis, you have to be comfortable with ambiguity and with shadows and with maybe never having a final answer.
And that's a scary thing for Western esotericists, because
yeah,
there's always a need for some answer with.
Yeah, nothing is definite here. And I cringe every time that, someone comes out with, oh, well, this is what a yogini is. And, this is how you have to work with them. And you have to do this and this. It's like, well, okay, that might be true in a certain context or with a certain guru's tradition. But what does the yogini tell you? What's your direct experience?
I mean, it's like trying to speak for what the goddess is, right? I mean, like, how can you actually speak for the goddess, or from a tantric perspective, that's also like trying to fathom the depths of womanhood, as men were utterly incapable of doing that, and how much more so with the yogini or the dakini or the goddess.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, Greg, two questions. One, prior to your kind of experience up in the mountains that you just described, did you have any kind of relationship or devotion or study into Kali? And second question, once you started to experience these things, how did you begin to approach or pursue the yogini? What was the next step there?
So as far as a relationship with Kali, I had always had a kind of weird, or at least unexplainable attraction to images of her. I mean, I can remember back even being, like maybe 16, 17 years old or something, and seeing a little framed photograph of her in a store on Haight Street in San Francisco, and just thinking, wow, what is this? And picking that up. I wish I still had it. That would be amazing. Mm-hmm. So there was nothing, I had no formal instruction or anything. I just knew I was attracted to that visually.
Yeah.
Which is extra funny just because of, the house I grew up in, it was pretty straightforward. I guess nothing too interesting or esoteric going on there. My parents were nominally Roman Catholic, I guess, but not really. Like they would, mm-hmm. My dad would go to mass on Christmas morning once in a while. That was about it. So yeah, there was that. There was basically this instant attraction to her, this instant connection in that sense. But fast forward several decades, before my trip to Nepal, I had gone through a pretty nasty divorce, and was sort of reassessing my life up to that point and what I'd been, doing, what sort of path I'd been on. And as part of that process, I had actually gotten some instruction on a Kali sadhana that I was working with pretty intensely. And this was part of another system that I was working with at the time for the Typhonian order. I'll just throw that out there. As part of a process with that, I was working on this sadhana pretty intensely. And I took that with me to Nepal. So that was kind of my framework, I guess you would say, in the background. And maybe it just ripened at the right time. Maybe it was the conditions. Maybe it was, a lot of things that built up to that period, but it all just sort of came together up in the mountains and sort of took me in a very different direction than anything I would have expected.
Okay, that's interesting. Makes sense.
What was the
second one? Yeah. How did you start to pursue the Yogini at that point?
So originally I was just working with the original sadhana, and as sadhanas go, the more it's like with any discipline, I guess, as you do it, as you really go deep into it, it starts to change, and it starts to change you. Obviously, or at least hopefully that's one of the reasons that people are doing this stuff, to get some sort of transformative experience or awareness, I guess. I mean, it's like it's like something Crowley said in one of his writings about how you might come to magic for one reason, but you end up doing it for a very different reason as you get deeper into it.
Right.
So the sadhana continued to mature. With that type of practice, you typically have a time scale that's set up that you're working with. So, for example, I had committed to do the original sadhana for 5 years. I ended up doing it for over 11 years. And I would say a lot of these other connections tended to open up while in the space that was created by doing the sadhana. So by repeatedly, formally encountering the goddess, things would start to open up. And by things, I mean outside of the sadhana. So sadhana is like, okay, you have a circle, you're sitting in a circle, you're doing these practices in a certain set time and place. But how does that bleed outside of this sort of artificial space you've set up? How does that get entangled into every aspect of your life? How does that really crack open your heart and your experience? And that is really one of the mysteries of a tantric discipline, I think, is how it starts to do this. I mean, they call it the grace of the Devi or grace of Guru that transforms your practice, which I guess is one of the reasons that you can't just read a ritual and hope to get some experience just like that. That's one of the ideas behind it, I guess.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the point, right? Of Tantra to kind of embody that practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and another thing that I think that's useful for people coming from a Western perspective to understand is that these aren't thought forms energized by ceremony. These are not that ceremony doesn't have an energizing effect, but when you're talking about Ma Devi or Shakti or Kali, or when you're talking about the Dakinis or the Yogini, you're talking about independently existent, self-aware entities with their own consciousness, proclivities, desires. And I think that's worth maybe looking at and talking about a little bit, is that these aren't things we are constructing in a memory palace or through ceremonial ritual, where these are the sadhanas that you're describing are used to adapt to and harmonize with and communicate with them, but they exist on their own with or without us. Would you say that's correct or incorrect?
I would say that's absolutely correct. Yeah. So the sadhana, the formality of the sadhana is it provides an initial structure. It's a launch pad. But the key is you have to be willing to step beyond that at a certain point. And obviously not too early, because you don't want to give up that structure. And I'm saying sadhana, but there could be a lot of ritual practices or techniques that might lead one in this direction. But what happened in my case was it started to open up to things like dream yoga. And I talk about this a bit in the book as well, and give some ideas on how to develop that aspect. But a lot of the connections with the yoginis would start coming through dreams for me. And I also should have mentioned this earlier, but I also have a pretty strong just meditation practice to supplement these types of things. I mean, if anything, I do more meditation than ritual at this point. And it is through meditation and through dreams that a lot of the communications would come through. And in fact, a lot of this book, Yogini Magic, came through dream work and just through realizations that happened while meditating, because that is what would open me up to these voices, to these energies and visualizations that would come through. That's always the tricky thing. It's like, how do you can put it in a book, but it's more about just the energy of experience. You know what I mean? So it's like how I've had people come up to me and say, well, how do I experience it the way you've experienced it? How do I experience them the way you experience them? And that's something I still I'm trying to figure out, like, how do you convey that? I mean, I've had a few people tell me that the book is contagious, and just reading it sort of opens them up, and that's in a way an entry point, and then they start working with these energies, with these goddesses, and that's fantastic if that happens.
And they are real. I mean, these yoginis are real. They're live. They're powerful. They're animated.
Yeah.
And I love that you're talking about the liminal space of dreams, because what we can talk forever intellectually about what dreams are, but for the esotericist, for the yogi, for the magician, dreams are more than just a epiphenomenon of consciousness arising from the brain or the processing of sensory information. They're a means of communication with the immaterial and the transubstantial.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I want to ask you something. You call them witch goddesses. Could you elaborate on why you use that terminology?
It was a bit of a play on the literal meaning of Dakini, witch, and then their association as goddesses. I mean, I do see them as goddesses in their own right, as well as emanations of the great goddess. So witch goddesses, sorceresses, enchantresses, all of these were kind of terms that were coming to me, and that were just really, really flooding me as I'm working with them and experiencing some of them. And it just seemed like a way to sort of try and bridge the gap, because by the gap, I mean to more of a pagan Western magical audience. I don't know if that worked fully, but my intent was, okay, I could have just written another Eastern Tantric book, and it could have been focused on the yoginis and that sort of thing. That would be awesome in and of itself, fantastic. But the real inspiration that I felt was, okay, how do I present these beings to more of a Western audience, and show that, you don't have to be halfway across the globe in order to encounter a yogini. They're right here. Space and time are something that our little brains create a model of, so that we can, interact in this timeline or what have you. But for the yoginis, they're I would call them trans-dimensional in that sense. I mean, for them, time and space are playthings, they're toys, and they can manipulate that. So sure, certain geographical locations might have different aspects of the energies, different ways of contacting them. But I wanted to present the yoginis in a context that might be a little more familiar to quote unquote Westerners. So in a pagan tradition. So that's, if you look at some of the rituals that are in the book, there's two reasons that they tend to appear more Western, like even from witchcraft or Wicca. I mean, one of them is that the actual yogini rituals or ways to approach them, I mean, first of all, they wouldn't go over too well in Western civilization. If you're looking at the roots of them, I mean, we're talking about things like blood sacrifices,
ritual with corpses, decapitated corpses.
Yep, exactly. And then, it goes on and on. I mean, I talk about this in the book as well, but how, like in my approach to them, it's been a little different, you might say. And I don't use a whole lot of ritual when I'm working with them because just of the ways that they've interacted. It's more meditation, I guess, more visualizations, spontaneous imagery, that kind of thing, sensory experience with the world. But I put rituals in the book because I wanted people to have some kind of framework, because if you're coming at it cold and you want, okay, I want to work with the yoginis, what do? You need to have some kind of framework, unless they're reaching out and poking you.
And yeah, you talked about the bridge. And I think a lot of Western audiences would be familiar with like a Hecate as like a flesh-eating witch goddess. There's some similarities there in some versions of her. I also see a kind of a similarity in the followers of Dionysus. I mean, there's the wine aspect, but there's also that flesh-eating aspect. That's an interesting connection that I've seen.
Yeah.
As far as the rituals and the practices in the book that you lay out, now, do these come from traditional practices? Because I'm not familiar with how things are going in the modern day as far as these practices, but the impression I got was that a lot of Indians around this area where these practices took place are fearful of Yogini and Dakini, and I don't know that. Are these practices still taking place?
Yeah, those are great questions. So they are still taking place. Usually it is, very secretive, obviously, and within certain tantric lineages. And I mean, one of the interesting things, or maybe it's infuriating, maybe it's fascinating, I don't know, but every lineage will have its own approach and its own sort of way of interpreting the teachings. So, in one case, there might be, say, a meat offering. Another guru might interpret meat as, okay, we're not going to use animals. We're going to use ginger, pretty common substitute. But yeah, so there are still living tantric traditions. I've worked with some of them. These days, I tend to be a lot more independent, but it is out there. I would think for yogini specific instruction, though, you would have to stick with a particular lineage for a fairly long time, to get that level of trust.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think a lot of them are reconstructions at this point. I'm pretty skeptical of any kind of unbroken tradition, claims of an unbroken tradition. There's probably stuff out there, but I don't think you're going to find it on the web.
Yeah.
You need to go to the villages in India, probably. I mean, around the yogini temples, there's still a lot of talk, I guess, and sort of superstition surrounding them. And I'm sure that there's some wild sadhus that have continued different traditions, at those temples throughout all these times, but we don't necessarily hear about them. They haven't really been studied.
So let me ask you this. It sounds like reading in your book and then doing my own research on the Yogini, another thing that really strikes me is the fact that their temples are so different from the typical temples you see in India. And there seems to be a reason for that, right?
There's a lot of speculation on what the reason is. But yeah, the temples are a very different architecture. So there are these circular temples with no ceiling. So they're open to the sky. Usually there's a pedestal in the middle where a representation of Shiva may have been as Bhairav, the tantric fierce version of Shiva. And then around the inside alcoves are often 64, but sometimes 81, or different combinations of alcoves where Yogini statues were. Most of them have gone missing or have found their ways to different museums around the world at this point. There should probably be a great Yogini reckoning at some point where they all come back together. But no, the temples are fascinating in that sense.
So they're completely open to the sky. And it seems like that's another thing to me that struck me, because I know that in Tantric Buddhism, the Dakini are definitely associated with the sky. And so there's this element not only of association with dreams, but with the sky, exactly. Right?
I mean, the Yoginis are thought of as, again, the witch symbolism comes up because witches fly through the sky as well. Yeah, the Yoginis, there's some descriptions of them where, they come flying through the sky with their hair totally wild and making these terrifying noises on the night winds as they descend. Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible imagery associated with them. As far as I know, there's no records that have been found yet in the West that I'm aware of that have described the actual ceremonies that may have been conducted in these temples. But that's both a blessing and a curse in a way, because you can look at the different tantras and sort of piece things together intuitively. But I think more importantly, it opens the door, it opens the gateway to how do these energies interact with you now directly. I mean, what is the circular temple but the circle of consciousness?
That's what I was going to ask you if you thought that. Yeah. And it also occurs to me that your mind training that you did with Dzogchen probably prepared you for this, because I know that at least in some schools of Tantra, Kali is considered to be consciousness itself. And so when you're experiencing the state of pure consciousness unfettered by the scaffolding of discursive awareness, you could say in a sense that you're experiencing Kali. And isn't also the sky associated with mind itself?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, things like sky gazing, that's a practice to help get into, or to help become aware of the nature of consciousness itself. This vast open sky, which is the mind.
So we have this intriguing connection here, on the one hand, with narratives of the actions of, say, witches, as we find in the European medieval narratives, and the actions of these figures in this tantric tradition in the East. And then on the other hand, there's this interesting element here of dream and of sky and of mind and of consciousness, which is just amazing, and I would say even miraculous, but also elusive, because you're dealing with something that really has to do with experiencing pure consciousness itself, and it's amazing to me because there's this really transcendent aspect, but then this immanent aspect to the Dakini too.
Yeah, definitely, and that's one of their most powerful aspects, I think, is that exactly they're both transcendent and immanent. I mean, and that depending on how you approach them is how they respond in kind. Hey, but I went off on a tangent and completely didn't even answer the ritual question.
Oh, that's okay.
But yeah, I was going to say that so a lot of the tantric specific rituals that you'll find in the book are from the source text I was working with, the Kala Yana Nirnaya.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but they're sort of reworded, obviously, and reframed in more of a Western context. And then, but if you were to look at the heart of these rituals and go into tantric sadhana and analyze with a tantric viewpoint, you would see that it's essentially that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the core of the practice. And then the Western stuff was sort of a framework around that. So you've got, a circle. You've got a circle in Tantra. You've also got a circle in, for example, Wicca. So I don't know. It was an attempt to kind of bring the two together. It may or may not have been successful from a ritual standpoint. It works great for me. It's always interesting to see how it affects people if they work with it.
So we've touched for a minute on the transcendent side of things, consciousness, dreams, meditation, the sky, but the Yogini, they really are very immanent, and they seem to be associated with different animals, trees, locales. Could you speak a little bit on that aspect too? Because they seem to be very closely associated with nature itself.
Yeah, there's a strong natural connection, I would say. I mean, almost to the point where, so I live in an area where I can get out into nature pretty easily. And it's always just this very psychedelic experience in a way, because the wind is talking, the trees are talking, different animals that I encounter are talking. And this kind of goes back to some of the older tantric texts, which will give indications such as, Kali or the Yoginis may appear as a black cat or a coyote or a wolf or a raven, these types of things. And or even any animal, any female animal specifically, tends to be seen as a sign of the goddess and of the yoginis. And if you engage in that as a practice, as a conscious awareness practice, just throughout your days, it really busts open this line between, what we think of as materialism and the dream world and, what is consciousness, because suddenly you realize that, wow, I'm in this mandala. This mandala is alive, and these beings are popping in and out of awareness. They may be going about their business, or they may be taking interest in me, but it's this living vision of just this constant exchange of energy between yourself, between the yoginis, the world. Where is that dividing line? Is there a dividing line? And I think the more that you engage with them, and the more that you sort of have this taste of consciousness and standing as awareness, it just really dissolves any kind of boundaries in that sense.
And they were depicted with animal features and animal heads in some cases, right?
Yeah, more often than not, they have these animal forms. So usually they would appear as these human female beings with different types of animal heads. And no one really knows the source of that. I mean, there's tons of speculation, and there's even scholarly, papers examining it with different theories. But I mean, again, with the yoginis, it tends to be undefined, and there is no one answer.
Got it. Would you advise caution when working with them? Is there any danger Because, like I said earlier, it seems like modern people in those areas tend to be superstitious when it comes to these things,
Yeah.
and it sounds like there is some potential for danger when it comes to these forces and these entities. What's your experience, and how would you address that?
I would absolutely say that caution is required. I mean, they should be approached with respect, very respectful, very open to approaching them as they are, instead of coming with, your preconceived notions or what you want to get out of them.
Yeah.
Like the whole transactional thing. Sure, there is some of that kind of energy exchange where, okay, if I give you this offering, will you do this for me? But I've always preferred to take it to just a deeper level, like an actual relationship. I mean, there are some people that you might instantly get along with, and there are people that you might think, oh, they look kind of dangerous.
Sure.
But with all of the yoginis, they tend to have a very fierce appearance, carrying swords, severed heads, blood dripping fangs. And it's interesting because one fascinating interpretation of this that I heard once about their depictions, this was from Stella Dupois, who's written a lot of yogini books, has done a ton of research with them. She commented that, maybe they were depicted so fiercely because it was meant to keep the uninitiated away. So it's both this intrigue of like, oh, wow, that's a very beautiful figure. But then as you come in a little closer, you see these fangs and blood and bones and whatnot. Is that maybe a gateway? Are they sort of saying, don't come closer unless you have a clear heart, a clear intent, you have respect, you have love? That's kind of how I interpret it. So if you look at sort of the traditional approaches in the tantras, they'll say things like, you shouldn't even recite their names unless you have that specific lineage behind you, because the yoginis within the tantric lineages are also associated with protecting that lineage itself. But there are, I mean, that kind of sends me on a tangent of where did those traditions come from in the first place? And I think I go off a little bit about that in the book, and this idea of, the yoginis are these wild, untamable goddesses. They pretty much do what they want of their own will. So who was it that said, okay, well, this grouping of yoginis is only associated with this teaching. This grouping of yoginis is only associated over here. And it comes down to men, to priesthood and control, trying to control these different powers, I think, maybe through pretty big offerings to gain their attention so that they would protect a particular lineage. I don't know. Nobody knows. But if you look at some of the Buddhist contexts for dakinis, you can sort of see that pattern as well, right? Where one of these spirits was subjugated and made to protect the Dharma, that type of thing.
Right.
But going back to the original question, are they dangerous? Should you approach them carefully? Absolutely. Don't approach it flippantly. Don't do it out of idle curiosity. Do it because you feel a connection or you want to experience them in a direct way. And if approached with a pure heart, with pure intentions, then they do tend to respond in a favorable way. Or at the very least, they won't respond to you at all, but they're not going to bite your head off unless you're approaching the wrong way.
Just like a person. I mean, if you're interacting with a person who is, if you're coming up to like somebody who is of a high station, who's noble, you should be approaching them with reverence and respect and a genuine sincerity.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's a relationship. I mean, I always come back to that. How would you treat someone that you are in love with. Your mind is always going to be thinking of them. You're going to be wanting to make them happy. You'll be bringing them nice things. These are offerings. Your whole demeanor will be different than if you are just going to, I don't know, you just want to throw something down and get something back in return. And sure, you might get a response, but it's going to be very different energetically.
Now, Greg, question. In your book, you speak about the Matrikas. There's Brahmi, Maheshwari, Kamari, Vaishnavi, Varahi, Indrani, Yogeshwari, Agareshi. Who are the Matrikas? And what's the relationship between the Matrikas, I guess the Sahaja Matrikas, I hope I said that correctly, and the Yogini? They seem to be Yogini, but at the same time, they're their own category of Yogini.
That's right. Right? They seem to have come about a little bit later. So the Yoginis themselves seem to have sort of developed out of these different tribal traditions and different village traditions. And then over time, they seem to have been collected into, you could almost think of them as like super yoginis, I guess, or the queens of yoginis. And these were the matrikas, the mothers. So usually there's the sapta matrikas. There's 7 of them, which are pretty common. But in the Kala Jnana Nirnaya, which seems to found a yogini cult, there are these 8 matrikas that are listed. And they really are like the generals of the goddess's army in a lot of ways. So it really comes into play if you're working with yantras, the diagrams that show the different energies in visual form. But each of the 8 yoginis each of the 8 matrikas emanates yoginis out of herself. So it kind of goes from the goddess to the matrikas and then out to the yoginis, this sort of endless flow of the energies.
So it's a flow from the cosmic to the particular.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, actually.
And for anyone familiar with Indian Tantra or even esoteric Buddhism, this is something that you see. You see this flowing forth of this form. What's interesting to me personally is the numerical symbolism of 8 and 64, because you have the number 8 and then it's fully unfolded into 8 multiplied by itself in the 64 yogini. That's super interesting to me because both 8 and 64 are numbers that are very intimately related with Mercury. Like if you have the planetary square of Mercury, it has 64 squares in it, and 8 is the number of Hermes or Mercury or whatever. And it's also, of course, the number of the compass. It's the number of the 8 directions of space.
And in fact, in some of the tantric rituals, you address the 8 directions of space. So it might be with the matrikas, or it might just be some undefined energy, but essentially you're dealing with these different directions in space to form your ritual space. So instead of just a circle, you're actually creating more of a sphere with these points.
And how concrete is this number 64? I thought I read somewhere that was kind of the popular number, but in some temples that necessarily wouldn't necessarily always be 64. It could be 40 something.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes 81. 64 seemed to pop up the most, but there's definitely not a lot of consistency, at least as far as the yoginis go.
And some of these yoginis have incredible, I love the names that you describe some of these yogini with in this book. I mean, it's incredible, like eternal dark goddess, mother of the sorcerers, enchantress of terrifying form who enjoys blood, auspicious dark goddess, mother of the world. This one, Mahakali Siddheshwari, radiant dark queen of the shaman magicians. I'm sorry, but these Some rad names.
So those, I agree, they're pretty amazing. But though, yeah, as far as the English translations go, those came about through working with them. I would say that was the longest part of the book was sort of bringing those pieces together, because a lot of that came through meditation and dream work. The English is sort of a lyrical interpretation of what the Sanskrit names mean, so like Yogini number 4, Karukala Razanatha. Karukala is a Dakini associated with witchcraft, with magic. Well, they all are, right? But in the Tibetan stream, at least, she is particularly associated with sorcery and magic and that type of thing. So, mistress of sorcery. And then Razanatha, she's offering a skull cup of nectar, Raza. And Natha is Lord or Lady, so the mistress part comes out. So they just kind of came together intuitively while working with them. But the actual name lists themselves, this particular one, it actually threw me for a loop, which goes back to the whole ambiguous aspect of the yoginis, because I had been working with this particular set of names for a pretty long time. I mean, 11, 12 years or something. And I was pretty sure that this was the names that were recited in the temple in Kamakhya in Assam, India, but it's not. I later found out that this set of names actually came through a lot later. This 64 goddesses were from, sorry, I'm totally blanking on the name, but there was a more contemporary guru who works with Kriya Yoga, and apparently he received these names in his work, in his transmissions. And then he revealed it out to the world for everyone to work with them. And yeah, it was kind of cool. I don't know anything about this particular teacher, but whatever he contacted, those yogini names that are associated with Kriya Yoga really were easy to tap into for me and really carry a powerful essence to them. So that's where that name list came from. And then I've got a few other ones in the back of the book that have been collected.
So something I wanted to ask you about is what are the 5 M's, and how are they used in conjunction with the veneration of the yogini?
So yeah, the 5 M's, the famous tantric offerings, they're called the 5 M's because each of the words for the element in Sanskrit starts with an M. So you got madhya, which is wine, mamsa, matsya, and so on. These are sort of the high tantric traditional offerings of meat, parched grain, fish, wine. It's always translated as wine, but it's essentially any kind of alcoholic or intoxicating beverage. And maituna, which is union, usually interpreted as sexual union. And these seem to have come from an earlier tradition where it was just meat and alcohol and possibly sexual union. So three elements. But those are the traditional elements that are used in, if you go and read some of the old Kala Tantras, like the Kala Jnana Nirnaya or the Kularnava Tantra, these sort of medieval classic tantras, these elements are talked about. And there's, or even if you're reading Arthur Avalon, Sir John Woodruff, all of his tantric translations, he talks about these quite a lot in his book Shakti and Shakta. But there's a lot of interpretation around these. On one level, there's a very literal interpretation, like, okay, offer meat, offer some rice, offer some fish, and so on. And then everybody gets intoxicated, and there's some kind of ritual tantric sex to generate heat and bliss as an offering. But then, depending on which tradition you're working with or which gurus are interpreting it for you, you might get totally different layers of interpretation. And some of this has to do with this sort of threefold aspect of, there's the Pashu, the beast interpretation, someone that probably shouldn't even be practicing Tantra in the first place. The Vira, who is the hero or an adept. The Tantric path is sort of traditionally associated with them. So maybe this is where the physical elements came into play more prominently. And then the Satya, or the highest level, the divine level, you might say, where the elements are totally transformed into just mind streams of nectar and energetic responses within the body that come from either the contemplation of these things or a different sort of experience of these things. Sort of like sadhana itself, where at first you're doing sadhana mechanically, maybe to get some sort of response, but then later on sadhana becomes more of a dance with the energies. You're not doing it to get something, you're doing it because the something enjoys it and is engaging with you. But the offerings are important in this work, however they're being presented, because it is through the offerings that energy is exchanged with the yoginis, and how they come in closer. They come closer to you, even to the point where, and this goes back to why you need to be cautious. Possession is a pretty common aspect of working with the yoginis, or just really powerful emotional responses or physical responses. Things can become unhinged if you're not, it just depends, right, on how you're approaching them and what sort of your level of experience is and that kind of thing.
That's intriguing. And it's interesting, though, because, again, you have this sort of flowing between the immaterial and the material. And I think one of the hallmarks of Tantra is that even in the simple offerings of folk Tantra as practiced by somebody who we might consider to be unlettered, there's still the fullness of the entire Tantra in that simple offering of humble meat and in devotion, because isn't it really the nectar of devotion?
Beautiful. That's absolutely right. And how does that nectar of devotion transform energetically? Because in Tantra you are dealing with energy. The world is Shakti, it is power, and your consciousness is the nectar that is the base for this energy to flow. And so, okay, just as one example, the human body. In Tantra, we don't discard the body. We're not ignoring it. Instead, you are embodied. So your senses, your experiences, those can be offerings. Your taste is an offering. Your scent is an offering. Your touch is an offering. Your eyes, what you see, that recognition as you look into another's eyes, or as you look into the sky, or maybe you see an animal or something. It's a full sensory experience that is represented by, for example, the 5 M's, but it's so much deeper than that. And I do talk a bit about offerings in the book, and I actually give some more gentle approaches to offerings, because, again, how you engage with the energy is how it responds in kind. So it's an area that's ripe for your creativity, really, and for your ability to just get more in tune with your own heart and how that expresses itself. And then what is the response to that? Do you want it to be an artificial response, or do you want something authentic, something that reaches into you directly and transforms you?
It seems like such a focus is on freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they, one of the yogini names and goddess names is Swatantra, which is basically by her own will, Swatantriya.
Something else I find interesting is that there seem to be tribes of the yogini. In your listing, for instance, you have the yoginis that descend from the tribe of Kali Nityas. Then you have the yoginis that descend from the tribe of Lalita, Trayapura Sundari Nityas, yoginis of the tribe of Great Wisdom, and there's also the yoginis who are of the tribe of serpents. So this is so intriguing to me for so many reasons, not just the fact that they're definitely sort of grouped into their own tribes or families here, but also the symbolism of we're seeing wisdom and serpents here. And for anybody familiar with, and you even use the word gnosis in this, for anyone familiar with Gnosticism, Sophia is directly associated with serpents and with wisdom, and also with the bridging of the higher and the lower in one figure. But these tribes seem to have, it's as if you're developing relationships with them and you have a certain aspiration towards spiritual development, it seems as though you might want to focus on a particular group of yogini. Yet, as you're saying, if you're really jumping into the practice and you're staying dedicated, you have no way of knowing where it's going to lead.
That's right. And in fact, the deeper you go, the more they will lead you and take you in directions that, you can't even begin to imagine. So having that openness and that willingness on your part to just engage with the unknown. I mean, because again, like this listing of yoginis that I have in the book, that's one that I've worked with that I connect with. But there are countless yoginis. I mean, they haven't even all been named. So it's a really deeply rich and rewarding area that you can engage with and dive deep into, and possibly discover yoginis that have not even interacted with human consciousness before. I mean, just that idea really gives me chills. That it's just so open in that sense.
So Greg, for people who are interested in this and want to pursue this a little bit more, other than your book, of course, what are some resources?
That is a really excellent question. It's something that I think about because there isn't a whole lot out there when it comes to yoginis. I mean, that's why I tried to give a wide variety of practices so that people could really start to engage with them and invite them into their life.
May I interject? It seems to me like what you've been saying in this interview too might be pertinent, is that the real resource is the direct experience.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, yeah, you can read about them. I mean, I certainly do. There's a lot of research, especially in the past, 15 years or so. There's a lot of research that has been coming out from academia. And that's cool. It's fun to read about, definitely. But that is so different from the actual experience in working with them that, yeah, I mean, I'm reluctant to list out books and research. Although one author that I really do like is Kavita Chinayam. I think I said her name correctly, hopefully. But she has written a few books on the Lalita Tripura Sundari and the whole tradition of Lalita and Sri Yantra, which engages with the yoginis in a very sweet and just nectar rich way that is beautiful, fantastic. So I highly recommend her books if you're going to read.
How do you spell her name?
So it's Kavita, Kavitha, and then her last name is Chinayan, Chinnaiyan. Yeah, and I would recommend Fractals of Reality.
What a cool name.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that's got the 64 yoginis of the Sri Yantra in it. So definitely worth checking out.
Cool.
And then another book of hers is Glorious Alchemy, which is just fantastic. Just reading it, it's just filled with nectar. So highly recommended.
It also seems to me like we didn't even touch on this point, but I think it's useful because we were talking about the circular temples, etc. You don't have to go to a Yogini temple, try and find a Yogini temple. It sounds like the crossroads, which is another intriguing connection or similarity, I should say, with witchcraft traditions, especially traditional witchcraft. The crossroads. It seems like you can go to the crossroads, and that's a very acceptable place to contact them.
I'm surprised that didn't come up earlier because it's so integral to it. The crossroads are, I mean, any of these liminal spaces. Liminal is so overused anymore, but it's true. I mean, these places where the dividing line between, consciousness and the unconscious, or self and other, or material and immaterial, or what have you. The crossroads sum that up beautifully. And, people reading the book, they might think, oh, he's just trying to present it in a Western context. So he's talking about the crossroads. But no, not at all. It's actually from the Tantras. The worship of Kali, the worship of these tantric deities, the worship of the yoginis did not just occur in these circular temples, but at the crossroads or at the graveyards, smashan, the cremation grounds in India. These types of places are where the tantric practitioners would go. And crossroads in particular are pretty easy to find, at least in my area, but pretty much all over the place. And they're fantastic energetic zones where you can leave an offering, establish contact. So yeah, they're very, very central to a lot of this stuff.
So would I be correct in assuming that that's also symbolic crossroads, like the place where forests and the plains meet, or the ocean, like where the ocean and the beach connect, or wild places where, abandoned buildings and, just places where people don't frequent, where things are getting wild, where things are becoming, again, liminal.
Yeah, beautifully put. I think that's absolutely the case. Even things like wakefulness and sleep and slipping into the dream realm, that sort of transitional stage. That's sort of the ultimate one in a way. Because again, as you work with yoginis, it's not going to be just, okay, I'm casting a circle or I'm making an offering. They will start to seep into your dreams in unexpected ways. And if you engage with them there, I mean, I have received, obviously a lot of the book came through that, but then I've also, throughout the years, I've gotten mantras that are unique to my work or to a certain context, different types of yantras and, meditative practices have come out of dream contact, to the point where, as far as ritual goes, I would say I engage more in dream ritual than physical ritual at this point. I don't know. That's always a tricky one, right? Because, I mean, before coming to all this stuff, I had a ton of experience with Western ceremonial magic. And I often wonder, how much of that has fed into this, or, how has that foundation helped to have sort of a solid ground to work with these energies. And I don't really know, to be honest.
It seems like there's a very astral part. Yeah. And that's another thing that you find in, we say witchcraft, but I think we could also say shamanism or shamanic, because when we talk about, I guess, anthropologically, quote unquote, European witchcraft, we're really speaking about, say, the indigenous shamanic tradition found among the peoples of that area, rather than the way that witches often uses in a pejorative way in many traditional cultures. I think what we're really talking about is a shamanic tradition of spirit flight.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate.
I am so inexperienced compared to you when it comes to this, but my little bit of experience I can say is that I just want to emphasize for the listener again, these are very real beings, very real. It's like people. I
Yeah.
mean, not human people in limited bodies, but they're people. They have opinions, they have desires, they have preferences, they have wills of their own, and that's part of the mystery, I think, is you're dealing with these goddesses, these divine beings, but at the same time that have this transcendent quality, but they the very imminence of them is that they interact with you in a personal way.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, we have maybe a rough idea of what some of them might be interested in, I guess, but it really comes down to a personal one-on-one experience. It's not like a grimoire where, okay, there's this list of spirits, and this one does so and so, and you must approach them this way, and blah blah blah. It's a lot more wide open and just ambiguous, and yeah, it can be scary, right? Because it is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen a lot of the time. But it is just such a direct, such a visceral connection that occurs. I mean, I've been doing when I would do external rituals, my partner would be sitting with me during sadhanas sometimes, and I would just be silently reciting a mantra, and she would start speaking in tongues or
Wow.
starting to, spontaneous dance or weeping. I mean, it's incredible, just the effects that would occur. Not to mention what would happen to your own consciousness, but just the fact that people around you that might not even be directly doing anything get affected by it. You need to tread carefully, obviously. I mean, have full consent and buy-in from people.
And it sounds like you have to be comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity and fuzziness. And as Westerners, we have trouble with that sometimes, especially those who are into ritual and things like that. They want this certainty.
Yeah.
They want this specificity. And you have to just like throw all of that out and be comfortable being in that place.
Absolutely. I mean, I am actually very passionate about that aspect. Whenever someone is telling me this is how a yogini is, or this is, how to approach them, this is the correct ritual, I'm just, I might laugh or I might get angry, but it's just the absurdity of, humans thinking that, hey, we understand this, we know what's happening here. And I mean, even if you look at some of the oldest tantras, it's still really damn ambiguous, because these things were, maybe it was an oral tradition, for example, never written down. And again, maybe it was dependent on the realization that one siddha, one adept had, and then they started telling people about it. And then, maybe that got codified into some kind of structure. But the yogini is just, I don't know. I hear them laughing at structure and that sort of thing. And just like, okay, you think this is how I am? Well, guess what? Something completely different happens.
Do you feel like experience with meditation is helpful? I know Dom, for instance, is a dedicated meditator, and I know you have many years of meditation experience under your belt, especially with your Dzogchen.
Yeah, I think it's essential, frankly. I mean, not just for yoginis, but any kind of magical work, or really any practices, because we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about the mind. So yeah, meditation has been foundational for me. I mean, I think that is what has helped to be able to encounter the yoginis and how to deal with them.
Well, and to deal with the whole issue of non-duality, ambiguity, comfort with those things. I think, for me at least, that's where meditation really does help in those areas.
Yeah.
because you are kind of touching on that non-duality and that interrelation between all things. And so for me, those distinctions between things aren't as important as maybe they used to be. And you see things, I've used this example before, but even in the Greek magical papyri, totally different area of the world, you have these spells that are like, a spell to this one particular god or goddess, a spell to Selene for XYZ, but then Selene may not even be mentioned in the rest of the spell, and they're talking about all these other goddesses as Selene. So
Yeah.
it's confusing, especially for someone who's just starting out into these things. Like, what's going on here? I thought this was the spell to Selene. Why are they talking about Persephone and all these other goddesses? And when you get to this place of non-duality, for me at least, or this meditation on those non-duality type ideas, those distinctions, just aren't as important anymore. It's hard to explain.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that.
Like, it's so crazy how hard it can be to let things be simple, to get unstuck. What was it? Who wrote one of the old new Falcon books? I think was Undoing Yourself Through Energized Meditation.
Yeah, classic.
From back in the day. And but it's so, excuse my language, it's so fucking hard sometimes. We're raised in this culture which just causes us to overthink everything. But it's so freeing and such a peaceful experience. It's so wonderful to just get outside of that and just be free and be okay with not knowing the answers to everything, and be okay with the uncertainty, because it opens up this vista. It's like you're in the mountains and looking out over this wide expanse, and there's this vista of openness all of a sudden where you don't have to question and you don't have to think, and you can just be present in the experience, in the moment.
Yeah, beautifully said. And the yoginis, I mean, they're all about spontaneity, sahaja, spontaneity. Just the immediacy of awareness of your experience. Right here, right now. You don't have to be in a certain context, or you don't have to recite a certain mantra. You just need to open your mind to be aware right now. Wake up right here.
I think that was a good place to kind of start wrapping the discussion, is on that point we just made. However, I do want to talk a little about Greg. First of all, are you working on any projects right now? Is there anything else that you have in the works, on the stove?
Yeah. I work kind of funny. I mean, it tends to be more inspirational. Like some of these people I know, they're just total workhorses, constantly working on books and things. But for me, it's more like, okay, there's something rising up and it needs to come out. So there can be long gaps between my stuff. But there's a couple of things I'm working on right now. One of them is a reprint of The Magical Union of East and West, but it's coming out from original Falcon, and it's going to be called New Aeon Tantra. It's significantly revised and expanded, and totally different feel than Yogini Magic. So if Yogini Magic was the first book of mine that you read, then this one might feel almost alien because it's a very different feel. But I'm excited about it because it has a ton of new material in it. And this is a book that's kind of been around in one form or another for decades now. So it's kind of cool to see it coming out yet again in a new and shiny form.
Awesome. What is there a timeline for that?
It's almost wrapped up on my end. I'm waiting for some illustration work and an introduction from a colleague, and should be ready to go. So hopefully winter of this year.
Cool. Yeah.
Or maybe early next year. And that's from original Falcon. And then I'm slowly working on a sort of sequel, I guess you could say, to Yogini Magic. So not a lot to say about that just yet. Magical silence, but it's in the works.
Well, keep us posted about that because we will definitely amplify the signal on that one when it comes out.
Awesome.
Where can people find you if they want to talk to you, if they want to, learn about what you're doing? What's the best way to find you, get in touch with you, follow your work?
Probably one of the best ways is going to be email. I have wild awareness at proton.me. I have a really crummy website. If anybody listening is a web designer, hit me up because it needs help. But my website is gregorypetersauthor.com. And it looks like something that was designed like in the early days of the web, because that's about where my web skills are. And then I am still on Twitter, or I guess it's X. I don't know how long that'll be around, but you can find me gpeters418 at Twitter.
Well, we just want to thank you so much, Gregory. This is such an important topic and it's such an interesting subject. And I think it's something that could genuinely benefit people's lives if they're willing to engage with it, explore it, and be open in that heartfelt way that you brought to mention many times in this interview. Love your book, love it. I adore it. It's really accessible. But it's also very deep, and I just want to thank you for putting this out into the public sphere. And I also want to say Om Shakti, and we pray that this humble podcast episode will be an acceptable offering to all of the Yogini and to the goddess herself.
Thank you so much. That means the world to hear that. And yeah, the book was written out of love as an offering to the goddess and the Yoginis. So Jai Kaliki Devi.
Cool. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, that was Gregory Peters with an excellent and interesting discussion on demystifying yoginis, or yoginis. I'm not sure what the plural is, so I ask our listeners to forgive me if I have said it incorrectly. With that said, very interesting subject, and I think Gregory is the ideal person to discuss it because he's living it. He's gone on an expedition out there. He's also brought it to the West through a wonderful book. I've loved this book. It's intriguing. It's filled with practical material too. So you can pick it up and you can start working on developing a relationship with these powerful female spiritual intelligences if you want to. You can use the book for that. Or if you're just interested in learning more about it. Yeah, and if you're involved in Tantric Buddhism or Hindu Tantra, or if you're interested in powerful female spiritual figures, I recommend this book for those reasons too, because I think it would supplement your studies or your practices. Besides that, I have found Gregory Peters to just be such a nice person, such a kind, friendly, good person. So even in that regard, I'm just grateful to have been able to get to know him as a person. And he's one of those people that I feel the work is justified in the person you find. You see a person who's clearly cultivated wisdom and compassion. His meditative practice is evident in the equilibrium of his personality and his peaceful demeanor. And that goes a long way too. Sometimes I think beyond the dramatic, flashy effects and experiences that people may have from rituals, to me, the greatest fruits that you can see in a person are contentment, serenity, equilibrium, equanimity, and peace. And though I would say that I have seen all of those things in him. So I want to give him a thanks for coming on the show. It was wonderful. And I hope in the future we can have him on again.
Well, it's going to be hard to follow that endorsement. But yeah, I agree. Just a fun guy to talk to. Interesting topic. We haven't touched really on that topic much at all. And so it was good for us to kind of go into that territory. And hopefully it was interesting and enlightening for our audience as well. So moving on, what do you have for us this week as far as your book?
I have a little book. I've really enjoyed this book. I've had it for a while. It's called Untold Tarot: The Lost Art of Reading Ancient Tarots by Caitlin Matthews. In my opinion, just about anything Caitlin Matthews writes is high quality. She is a wise woman with great insight and much experience, and she has, she's written many books on many spiritual subjects, magical subjects. This book is just an interesting book because it discusses the traditional use of tarot in a cartomantic context. So Untold Tarot goes into old school traditional tarot reading. So it goes into divinatory skills which originate in continental cartomancy and interpretive techniques that come from cartomantic interpretation, and it's more true to the way the tarot was originally used. The name of the book is Untold Tarot: The Lost Art of Reading Ancient Tarots by Caitlin Matthews. I definitely recommend it. It's really an excellent little book. Really pleased with it. It's just a nice thing to have on the bookshelf. I'm a reader of several decades at this point, and I am familiar with much of what's in this book, but it is also nice to have a compendium of the traditional interpretations of the cards and traditional methods of reading the cards. It's just nice to have all of that. The way people look at tarot today is not the same way people looked at it in the first, say, 100 years after its inception, for instance. And it was used in a certain manner. And this book will help you to understand that, help you understand the context of the tarot in relationship to other forms of card divination, and also help you to understand some important and often neglected elements of the tarot, again, such as the virtues which are present in the tarot, the medieval Catholic context of the tarot. Paul Hewson does that too in his excellent book, the most recent one he put out on the tarot.
Great. Sounds very interesting. Thank you for doing that. Okay, that is it for us today. Thank you to everyone who's listening. As always, we appreciate you. Feel free to promote us, like us, subscribe, share, etc.
We are grateful for the support. Very grateful for the support. We've been doing this for a while, and it's still a labor of love. We don't make a cent from it. This is just to do something we enjoy doing and explore things that we're passionate about and share them with you in the hopes that we can be a helpful resource to those of you who are also seeking insight.